This is the DRF Sports Form podcast. Here's your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale.
Hello and welcome to the DRF Sports Form podcast. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale, back with you in the Brooklyn bunker, recording this a little bit early in the week. It's Wednesday night. That may inform some of what you hear over the course of the next hour. This show's going to be a little bit different than the DRF Players podcast in terms of format, and I'm not just saying that because we're going to be talking about sports and sports betting rather than horse racing. The show, at least this edition of the show, is going to have three distinct segments. We're going to start out with a roundtable segment, complete with two guests to talk about some of the issues going on in the NFL as it pertains to betting. Then I'm going to have a one-on-one interview with a very special guest, my good friend Rob Neyer. He has a new book coming out, and we're going to be talking about the Major League Baseball playoffs. Lastly, I'm going to do a little bit of a monologue as we close the show. Should be fun. I'm looking forward to it. Our maiden voyage here on the DRF Sports Form podcast. And first and foremost, I'd like to bring in two guests. The first guest, he is the managing editor of that aforementioned DRF Sports Form. He's an industry veteran and an ace handicapper in his own right. He is Scott Gramling. Scott, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Really good to be with you here. This is best part of the football season, I think, as we're just getting into October. Got a little bit of a sample size, but still a lot of opportunity to take advantage of some what I would call kind of misguidance of lines coming out of Vegas. So happy to talk about it and really appreciate you having me on.
Excellent. We'll definitely get into some of the specifics of that throughout our time today. Our next guest, you know him as the co-host of the DRF Players podcast. You might not, well, actually, that's not true. If you've ever listened to the podcast, you've heard him talk about his days as a high school football coach in Texas. And I feel like his knowledge of the X's and O's combined with his gambler's mentality, as well as many years of experience betting, if not writing about and analyzing sports wagers, I think he's going to be the perfect person to bring on in here. On the other show, we call him the People's Champion. On this show, I think I'm going to stick with Mr. Friday Night Lights. I'm talking about JK, Jonathan Kinchen. What's up, my man?
What's going on, PTF? No, I'm excited to get on here and talk a little bit. The thing I'm the most excited about is the people that listen to the DRF Players podcast know that you have a sign-off at the end where you say, may you win all your photos. I am in suspense for the next 58 minutes waiting to hear how you close this thing out.
I like it. Funny enough, I already recorded that part of the show. One of the things that'll be different about this one is with the different segments, I'll be doing it a little bit piecemeal. I will leave you in suspense. I will make you not only download, but also listen to get that information, JK. All right, let's dive right in and talk about some general things regarding football. And Scott, I'm going to give you an unscheduled one based on what you were saying before about how this is your favorite part of the season. I was considering asking you guys anyway how you marry sort of handicapping angles, the kind of things we see week to week in the DRF Sports Form, as well as some of the other StatFox products as well, the Platinum Sheet, the best bets that you guys put together. It's an interesting hybrid of data that I feel like you might call more algorithmic data, and then the sort of trends and type of things that we're more accustomed to hearing when people talk about sports betting. At this part of the season, how do those various pieces of the puzzle fit together, and why do you like this type of the season so much?
Yeah, I think I like this type of the season so much because what you have is overreactions to how teams are performing without really digging beyond the numbers to see who those teams have faced. So I'll just give you an example because it's fresh in my mind. It happened just about an hour ago here in the office where we're talking about the Redskins and the Redskins defense and how they've given up a very low amount of big plays, both in the passing game and the running game, but especially the passing game to this point in the season. When you dig deeper in that and you see that they've played against Sam Bradford and Andrew Luck, who's dinking and dunking, I think that just shows an example of perhaps an overreaction, and specifically, I feel, to this spread on Monday night going against the Saints. I'm surprised that that line is only 6.5. I had that line as toggling between 7.5 and 8, which I know doesn't doesn't seem like a big difference, but as we all know, when you're on one side or the other of the 3 or the 7, it is a big difference. And I just think that's an example of where, it's a tough job making these books. And I feel like by week 10 or 11 of college or pro, the bookmakers really have a strong enough sample size to be able to make more accurate lines, whereas I feel like at this point there's a bit more kind of serving the public as to what the perceptions are going to be. And, when you see a team like the Ravens and what their point differential is, I feel like bookmakers, as much as they might want to set that line at pick'em, kind of has to set that line as the Ravens favored by 3 because of the action that's going to be coming in, from sharps and the general public alike. So I feel like it's just a point in the year where there's more to expose because the bookmakers are kind of caught in between what the perception and the reality is among sharps and the public.
JK, I want to bring you in on this. You're somebody who I know has certain statistics that you look at, and you'll even maintain your own database for both college and pros when it comes to stats. How do you reconcile what Scott's talking about with the sample size this early in the year versus the signal you can get out of the numbers that you like to look at, and reveal for the people, if you don't mind, what some of those numbers are?
Yeah, I think like in racing, a lot of the stats that are often people look at are noise. Yards per game is noise to me. Rushing yards is noise to me because like Scott was saying, it's misleading because it depends on who they were playing. It matters if they were running in a 1-turn mile or going a mile and a quarter. It's a big difference. Depending on who they're playing. One of the stats that I've found in football that seems to tell a really good story and paints one of the best kind of more complete pictures is third down conversion. And it's for a lot of reasons. It ties in the offensive coordinator and the defensive coordinators, how in tune they are with the players they have and what their strengths are. It ties in how good a team is on first and second down. Obviously, doing well on first and second down increases your chances of getting them off the field on third down because they're going to be in third and long situations. It also ties in the quarterback's accuracy. It ties in the quarterback's playmaking ability, the receivers, their consistency, the offensive line strength and protecting and all those things. And so there's a lot of things that the third down conversion rate can lead you to. And so when the season starts, I feel like that's one that you can kind of lean on, and it's one that I often give a lot of credit.
And the sample size, even though it's a small sample at this point in the season, you're still finding what you'd call some signal in there.
Absolutely. If you look at it, the good teams are typically good on third down on offense and on defense. And then the bad teams aren't. The Rams, I think, are second right now in third down. The Chiefs are third in third downs. And so you can definitely it definitely correlates with the win-loss record. But the win-loss record is another one I think that can be a little bit misleading. A 2-2 team or a 1-3 team has just as much right beating an undefeated team based on who they've played and the circumstances in which those games have unfolded.
Well, I have a few specific questions for you on these regards, but Scott, feel free to piggyback on that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think it's such a good point. And I guess two things I'll just sort of add to it. But the third down conversions, I could not possibly agree more. I just feel like that is representative of teams that are prepared, and teams that are prepared are well coached. And that's where you can really uncover some value. And the other thing, just, what JK is saying, with the misleading stats, I'll give you another example. And with the win-loss records, Miami 3-0. Going into that game against the Patriots. And, this is one that I was all over. I could not believe that spread was 6.5. That had to have been a 10.5 point spread. But because the Dolphins had a 3-0 record, it was not. The Dolphins had the 29th ranked pass defense coming into that game. Now, that causes you to look deeper. If they've played Drew Brees and Jared Goff and some of the top quarterbacks, then you can really reckon that that's a real number. But it was a number that deserved to be even lower than 29th because the quarterbacks they had faced were Marcus Mariota, Blaine Gabbert, Derek Carr, and they went against Sam Darnold. So not exactly, I don't think that's going to be the 2018 Pro Bowl class. And it just showed that the combination of injuries to the Dolphins and the fact that they were not nearly as good at 3-0, and you didn't even really have to dig that deep into the numbers. It just showed a lot of value in that game.
Let's talk briefly about the Patriots. They're involved in the Thursday night game. A lot of people will be listening to this. That game will have already been played, so I don't want to drill down too much into it. But, Scott, I know from the last time you're on the show that when you're on the other show, the DRF Players Podcast, that you are a Patriots fan. You historically have a good feel for them. I was just curious to ask you if you think that Dolphins game is going to really represent a turning on of the afterburners for them. Are you expecting more of the Patriots we've come to see the last several years as opposed to the group that stumbled a little bit early in the season?
Yes, them stumbling early in the season is certainly nothing new. That has happened in recent years. I think this was really a case of a tough spot, right? Going against that Jaguars defense, down Julian Edelman, and with an offensive line that's still being figured out, with a rookie running back who missed the season opener, not only the season opener, but a lot of the preseason. I felt like going into that game, the Patriots were more in mid-preseason form, if you will, as opposed to week 2, whereas the other side of the ball, the Jaguars, that is a top 3, if not top 2 or 1 defense in the NFL. You come off of that, then you play in Detroit, and that Lions team is a lot better than they showed in the season opener against the Jets. Whether you want to believe that the Jets knew the plays, that certainly seemed to be the case. But you have Matt Patricia, who knows that Patriots defense better than Matt Patricia. He coached it for a number of years, and he also has familiarity with the Patriots offense. So when you look at that kind of matchup, I know mainstream media likes to be like, oh, Bill Belichick, the teacher versus the pupil, and, how's Matt Patricia going to be able to get through this? Well, the fact of the matter is Matt Patricia probably had more of an advantage knowing the Patriots as opposed to somebody like Bill Belichick not having that much familiarity, and the Patriots coaching staff not having that much familiarity with the Detroit Lions. So I think it was really more indicative of a tough spot early on, shorthanded a little bit. And I feel like from this point forward, the Patriots could end up being a little undervalued for the next couple of weeks. The real intriguing matchup to me is going to be that Patriots-Chiefs game. That's Sunday night, October 14th. But, with the Chiefs kind of being the darlings with how that offense is playing, the big difference, obviously, between the Chiefs and the Rams is the respective defenses of those teams. The Rams being a top 10 defense, the Chiefs being a bottom 5 defense. So I think there's going to be you're going to have time to take advantage of overreaction to the Patriots playing so poorly, relatively speaking, against the Jaguars and the Lions. But that won't last long. I feel like by the time we get to the Chicago game on October 21st, there might not be any value left in those lines.
JK, I know you had a quick thought at least on the Thursday night game. Why don't you hit us with that?
Yeah, I like the over in the game. Often you'll see when I'm fortunate enough to be on with you guys and talk a little bit about some plays I like. I get on over-unders a lot, and mostly under, so not overs too much. But I think that a couple things are in play here. One, it's a short week for both teams, and when you have a short week, in my opinion, that's advantageous to the offense. The defense, one of the hardest things for defenses and the most time they spend is getting lined up, and that's how they can play sound defense is getting their alignment corrected. And the shorter the week is, the more difficult it is, especially when you're playing teams like the Patriots, who have a lot of personnel situations where they can line up Gronk in all kinds of different places. They're going to get Julian Edelman back, which means they're not going to have any film with this new version with Julian Edelman there. And then also the Josh Gordon factor. You played a little bit last week. He'll probably play a little bit more this week. And so now I have a feeling the Colts are going to struggle a little bit trying to get lined up to the Patriots. At the same time, the Colts are and to what I've seen, are leading in third down conversions. So to me, there's going to be a lot of points being scored in this game. So for me, I like the over in that side on the short week.
As tempted as I am to go into my sob story about making a bet in running on the Colts on Sunday, we're just going to gloss right over that and move on to my next question. And JK, that question, you, of course, You live on the planet Texas. Sunday night, the Battle of Texas. Houston favored by 3.5 over the Cowboys. Will you be playing this game, and how? And give us a little insight into your team affiliations maybe before you give the answer as well.
People always ask me, like, who's your football team? And I always tell them I root for the Texas Longhorns. And in college, and I actually care if they win or lose. And in the NFL, I root for who I bet on. Being in Dallas-Fort Worth my whole life growing up, watching the peaks and the valleys of Cowboys fans, and as silly as they can be, the same play and playing style that Romo would have to win a game that also led to him throwing a pick six. They would get mad about one and love the other, and it used to annoy me. So I always kind of rooted for them to lose. So I don't have an allegiance. In this game, I actually did like the under. I haven't got caught up this week, but previously last week, the Houston Texans, based on negative plays in the run situation, and then also sacks and quarterback hits, their offensive line was performing the worst of all the people that I was keeping track of their stats. So poor offensive line play. The Cowboys are running the ball a ton. They're not running a lot of plays. The clock's going to keep running. There's going to be a lot of punts in this game. I think they'll go under in this situation. If I had to pick someone to win, I would just take the Cowboys as the home team. But I don't think the Texans are very good.
Now, Scott, we don't want you to give away the store. You've got picks in the best bets. You've got picks in the Platinum Sheet, picks in the DRF Sports Form. But I was curious just to give you an opportunity if you had any particular insight on this game before we move on to some of the others I wanted to talk about.
I really don't. I think the line is right. I think the total is right. I think Texans by 3 is the home team with a over under 45. It feels like a 24-21 type of game with me. I really couldn't find any value on either side.
All right, let's move on. One line that I noticed, according to the Sports Forum power rankings, was a little bit out of whack, and one that interested me because it might even have the wrong team as the favorite. The Packers being favored against the Lions in Detroit definitely seems like there are some lingering questions about the health of Aaron Rodgers. I was just curious to see, and Scott, I'll start with you, if you thought the right team was favored here.
No, I don't think the right team is favored here. I think, again, there's value to be found in the Lions because of how bad they looked in a national TV game Monday night opener against the Jets, and it hasn't corrected to where it should. They're, for whatever reason, not getting that much credit for having beaten the Patriots like they did. They ended up, losing that close game against the Cowboys, a game that could have gone either way. I feel like the Lions are the better team, and there's no way they should be getting points at home here. I think it's you look at what the Packers have done, and, they pulled out that game against the Bears week 1, and then in week 2, the tie against the Vikings doesn't look as impressive when you see what the Vikings have done since then. And really, the Packers got their clocks clean on the road against Washington. So I feel like there is a significant amount of value here. I'm throwing out the Bills-Packers game. I don't think you could read anything into that. I just think the Lions are the better team, and the fact that you can get a point and then some places 1.5, maybe 2 with a home team that I think is the better team. There's significant amount of value there to me.
JK, you're the biggest Aaron Rodgers fan I know. Are you concerned about his mobility at this point? Do you think he'll be able to do the Aaron Rodgers kind of things we've come to expect, especially when we bet on him?
I'm definitely concerned. I mean, they're not as good. They're just not stacking up how they have in the past. But here's what I'll say about them look, when I walk in my house, I have a shelf where I have the silver wig for Bob Baffert on one shelf, and then I have an Aaron Rodgers jersey on the other. It's like I can't pick against him, so I would pass on the game just because he's that dynamic. I don't care what the line is and who he's playing. He's always going to have a chance to kind of mix up the situation. I will say this, if you are looking at the game, at least take into consideration that the Packers offense and the Patriots offense is similar-ish, right? I mean, we have the same elite quarterback and a lot of the possession throws and a lot of the screen stuff and the hurry up. one of the things I think a lot of people do is they say, oh, well, the Lions did really well against the Patriots, so they can probably do well against the Packers. I actually look at it a little bit differently, is now the Packers have all that film with all of those formations, all of the how, they're going to know where the Lions are going to line up based on how they lined up to Tripp and Trey and the tight end, with Gronk lined up. They know where they're going to line up when Jimmy lines up on the outside. When Rex Burkhead lines up a kind of swing man back, they know what's going to happen when Randall Cobb does the same thing. So they're going to kind of know where the Lions are. So there's a little bit of an edge there for the Packers. But look, I think this is probably a pass game for me, but I'll obviously root for Aaron Rodgers.
Very entertaining and amazing to know that there's somebody you have even more of an allegiance to than your man Bob Baffert with your silver wig and all that. That's good I'll file that information away for future use. I definitely want to give you guys a chance to talk specifically about a play you really like. But before we get to that, I'll have one more quick question for each of you. And I'm going to start off with you, Scott. You mentioned before about the Dolphins being brought back to earth last weekend. This weekend they have Cincinnati. Cincinnati have been pretty darn good so far. 3-1 at home, 3-1, and 6 of their next 8 games are at home. Is this a legit team to watch over the next couple months?
It is, and it is in terms of being a 9-7 or 10-6 type of team. They're not. I still think there's questions in that passing game, and there's questions specifically with that offensive line. But look, they've done what they needed to do to this point. But injuries are something that could end up playing a role. I'm not entirely sure that getting Burfict back is the best thing for this team. He seems to kind of set them sometimes in a over-aggressive way. It's almost like the bad kid in the class. When he's absent, they're a little better behaved, and then that kid gets in and everything runs a little haywire. So that'll be interesting to watch on the defensive side of the ball. I liked the Bengals a lot. I know this now sounds like hindsight, but I thought that their regular season win total hovering around 6.5 before the season I thought they were far undervalued, because the fact of the matter was when they got rid of their offensive coordinator after the first 2 weeks of last season, they did start to show signs of turning things around. The weakness last year being the offensive line, they addressed it with some relatively minor moves. They did draft the Price, the center out of Ohio State. He's been banged up a bit. I think it's like anything in the NFL. You really do have to take it week to week. I know it's a cliche coach speak that we hear a lot in mainstream, but you can get too far ahead because injuries do play such a factor. And I think a lot of what J.K. just mentioned is such a good point, where as teams have more success, that success gets put on film. And the tendency with most teams tends to not be enough self-scouting. So what they will end up doing, hey, this is working. We should just keep doing this. But the other teams are seeing what they're doing, and they're able to react to it. And I think it's sometimes why we see, I don't mean to pick on Andy Reid, but the Chiefs kind of come storming out of the gates. I almost feel like Andy Reid is the mad scientist in his basement, kind of all spring and summer long, coming up with all these new formations. And, if you watch the Monday night game, right, they got one guy's going to motion, and another guy's going to motion. And, he just does a great job of catching everybody off guard. But like they did last season, right, they started off 6-0 straight up and against the spread, and it came back to them where you start getting this stuff on film. Teams know how to defend it better. So I feel like that's something to be wary of with the Bengals as these lines start coming out. They're a 3-1 team right now. Are they good enough to be laying 6 to the Dolphins? It's probably the right number, but I think a win here, and you could start seeing some value going against the Bengals going forward.
So my final question for you, JK, is going to piggyback off that as somebody who's spent time on the sidelines. That point about the ability to make adjustments and then make adjustments to those adjustments. How we talk about that as sports fans and as bettors, as somebody who's been over there on the sideline making those adjustments in real time. How real of a thing is that, and what experience do you have with it personally?
I think it's a direct correlation to the coordinators as well as the kind of leaders on both sides of the ball. More importantly, obviously, the quarterback. And so the good teams tend to do a good job at that. I've had a lot of success in the past with second half wagers where you can see that that there are some unfortunate events that were happening, or they were getting caught off guard by something, but you could see that they started to figure out how to beat the blitz, and they were starting to make some adjustments, and they're going to come out in the second half and do that as well. I will say this, a lot of the adjustments that you want to make, you need to make them during the week. You need to, the good coaches prepare for the curveballs that are going to be thrown at them on Saturdays and Sundays. And so, you can kind of follow the history of how these teams and these coaches have performed, but it's definitely important. It's a very important aspect of the game of making sure you can adjust on the fly.
All right, JK, we're going to keep it with you for one play to release for this upcoming Saturday or Sunday. Is there something you're excited about that you're willing to share at this time?
Yeah, one of my favorite bets, and I don't know how real hardcore sports guys feel about it, but one of my favorite bets is the teaser. I love getting those 6 to 7 points in my favor. I feel like I can run games together if I can get those extra points. And one of my favorite types of plays is when you can tease a team down to just having to win, where they're a 6, 6.5, or 7 point favorite. So one of the teams that I'm going to use in a 2 or 3 team teaser this weekend would be the Los Angeles Rams traveling to Seattle. I think the bandwagon is a little bit empty for the Seattle Seahawks for the success they've had in the last 3 to 4 years. I think that they are Russell Wilson is extremely dependent on the run game and a good defense. And I just feel like he's always going to be behind when he's playing against the Rams. They're a legit football team. Their coordinator calls a great game. They've got some stars on defense, some great possession receivers, and obviously anyone who plays fantasy football knows what Todd Gurley brings to the table. And so I think the Rams are one team that you can tease them down to just win. And then I think that, like Scott had mentioned, that the national TV games are very powerful in the market. In Minnesota, although I thought they played really well, did lose in front of everyone, I'm going to tease them up to 10.5, 10 points. And see if I can't keep them in the game there. And those are 2 teams that I'm looking to involve in a teaser this weekend.
That Vikings-Eagles matchup, definitely one of the marquee games of the weekend. If we had more time, I'd ask you guys more specifically about that. But we are running short on time, Scott. But, folks who want all the info from you, once again, the Platinum Sheet, the best bets, you can go to foxsheets.statfoxsports.com for that one. That's foxsheets.statfoxsports.com. And of course, at drf.com, folks can also get their hands on the DRF Sports Form itself. But I understand you are willing to release a play with us on the air today as well.
You better believe it. And the play I'm releasing is in the Chiefs-Jaguars game. The Chiefs have been rolling this year, but this is where it comes to an end. And I like the Jaguars plus 150 on the money line. I feel like this is a tough spot here for the Chiefs. You look at how they've dominated within the division. They're 18-1 straight up, 15-4 against the spread over their last 19 games against the AFC West opponents. I feel like those are the type of games Andy Reid is always working hard, throwing in new wrinkles. Now they're coming off a short week. They are 2-10 against the spread at home against the AFC South. But I think what that's indicative of is the fact that they stay one step ahead of their division rivals, and I think it's a more level playing field here. You look at road teams coming off the Monday night game. Last season, such teams that were playing on a Sunday after having played on the road on Monday, 5-11 straight up, 4-12 against the spread. Those 4 wins came against weak opponents. I won't go into all the details of it, but the Lions were one of those losers. Aaron Rodgers, Packers were one of those losers in the game that Rodgers ended up injuring his shoulder in the first quarter against the Vikings. I just feel like it's an awful tall order here for a quarterback that's making his 6th career start to go against an elite defense coming off a short week, not only a short week, but one on the road in the thin air in Denver. I feel like this is just a spot where The Chiefs are being a little overvalued based on everything they've done. You cannot ignore the fact that Chiefs defense has a lot of issues, and that's a defense that Blake Bortles and company will be able to move the ball against. I love Jacksonville here, straight up.
Great stuff. Guys, fantastic job today. Thank you so much for your time. And because no deed goes unpunished here at the DRF Sports Form podcast, we'll have to have you back on again soon.
That would be phenomenal. And I just want to wish everybody out there a very profitable upcoming weekend.
JK, a closing thought?
Thanks for having me, PTF. Let's get on these, run this money back, get to make some money on Saturday and bet it on Sunday.
And now I'd like to welcome to the Sports Form podcast for our first ever one-on-one interview segment, a man who I met, oh my goodness, more than 20 years ago now. And one of the relationships I'm kind of proudest of in my professional career, because it started with a fan letter and became a friendship. And this is a writer who's really affected my view of the game of baseball, a game that I certainly grew up watching and playing. But I feel like I'm not the only one. I feel like he's a man who inspired dozens, if not scores, if not hundreds of baseball writers to take a little bit of a different approach when it comes to writing about the game of baseball. Some might say a more sabermetric approach. You probably read him on ESPN.com back in the day or at some of his stops since. You probably read some of his other books. You've certainly heard of a book on which he was a consultant called Moneyball. Some things you don't know about Rob Neyer: active birder. He's probably seen more birds than you. And he's also probably the only person you know who's a baseball commissioner. And we'll get to a story about that and the West Coast League in a little bit. I'm talking, of course, about Rob Neyer. Rob, welcome to the DRF Sports Form podcast.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
It's great to get a chance to catch up with you. And I want to start by talking about the current Major League Baseball playoffs and the playoff odds. I know that there's definitely a connection between sabermetrics and the work you've done over the years and the gambling side of things. We're eventually going to get to talk about your new book, Powerball, The Anatomy of a Modern Baseball Game, which is going to be on sale in just a couple of days. But let's start by looking at this World Series picture, looking at the odds in the marketplace. Is there a team that you feel is radically overvalued or undervalued? And before I let you answer, I will point out that we are doing this before we know the result of the second wild card game between the Yankees and A's, and that may influence what you're about to say.
It may, but I will say that the A's and the Yankees do have among the weakest. They're among the least favored among to win the World Series, and I think that's fair. The Braves are the other team that's sort of down in that group, and I think that's fair too. I think the odds do a pretty good job of ranking the teams, with the Red Sox and the Astros on top. Not surprising, considering that they were pretty clearly the two best teams during the regular season. That said, I think more than ever before, at least when you talk about winning a World Series, you can just sort of throw up your hands because, in terms of a favorite, because yes, the Red Sox and the Astros are almost certainly the best teams, have the most talent, and they probably deserve to be at the top. They also have to win the World Series, they have to get through, 3 rounds of playoffs, clearly. And the playoffs, I think, are probably more unpredictable than they've ever been, starting basically this year. So this is completely uncharted territory. If there is some genius out there who can figure out how to figure the odds when pitching staffs are being completely reworked, the idea of a postseason pitching staff, I mean, good for them.
postseason, I feel like, was a little bit of the canary in the coal mine in a way for the different ways in which pitchers have been deployed in 2018. Do you think that what we're going to see this postseason in terms of the way that managers use pitchers is going to model what we've seen in previous years, or do you think there might be another evolution waiting to happen?
I think we're going to see it in the American League wild card game. The A's are going to start a pitcher whose record this season was 0-1. That's just not something that anyone's ever seen before. I think the only parallel, I think there was a game in the 1945 World Series where, the Tigers started someone who hadn't won a game all season because he was in the Army. But he was a great pitcher. He just hadn't pitched for them that season. Starting a relief pitcher, basically, who pitched 24 innings all season and didn't win a game, it's just utterly unprecedented. Now, I don't think we're going to see much more, if any, of that this offseason. This postseason. I guess the A's might do it again. They probably would do it again. We're not going to. I doubt if we're going to see much of anything quite as radical as what the Tampa Bay Rays did this year, starting their quote opener a great number of times. But I do think we'll see more of what the Astros did last fall, and particularly in the World Series. I'm sure you remember how few innings they got out of their starters in a few of their games, and it works when you have 4 or 5 great starting pitchers, or really good starting pitchers with, maybe better said, great stuff, especially when only asked to work 3 or 4 innings. Why would you not do that? Very few teams have 3 aces, but many teams have 1 or 2 aces and then 2 or 3 more guys who are really good in short bursts. So if there's a way to leverage that sort of talent, you're going to do it. You're going to do it. At least a lot of teams are going to do it. So I suspect that we are going to see things this fall that we haven't seen before. And I also think that, obviously part of wagering is predictability, right? And if you can't predict how a manager is going to use his pitching staff, now where are you? And again, I just don't know. I think obviously if you have to bet, you're going to bet on the best teams, and we know who those are. But it's hard to know how the managers are going to use these pitching staffs.
It's interesting when you look at the betting lines trying to find any whiff of value. I will say that the LA Dodgers, who I've been following very closely, there's going to be a story about the Dodgers in another part of this podcast. But having followed them very closely, having looked at their underlying numbers, 6-1-ish to win from here doesn't seem terrible value. I think I'd be more inclined to try to get stuck in there than to try to fight it out between Boston and Houston. I just feel like the Dodgers also they feel like a team that the form is probably better than it's been at any other point during the year. Have you watched much of them this year? What's your general thought on the Dodgers? And then I'm going to follow up with a question about the Rockies.
Well, I like the Dodgers. I think that the one thing they really have going for them that obviously the A's and the Red Sox and the Astros don't, is that the Dodgers would seem to be the class of the National League, especially based on past history. And when I say past history, I mean prior to 2018. And a lot of, I'm sure your listeners know this, but a lot of, I think, baseball fans would have a tough time accepting the idea that what happens before this season does have some relevance, does tell us something about the quality of a team. I think it should be obvious. We know that most people would accept that you would look at a player's history prior to just this season to get the best read on how good he actually is. But what is a team? It's just 25 players. So the past history should matter. And I think that the Dodgers, obviously having been outstanding in 2017, having won 6 straight division titles. Now a lot of the players have changed, but it's an incredibly talented group of players. Now the guys on the field aren't the ones that they thought they would have all season because of some injuries, but it's a really good team. I think one thing that would give me pause, and again we get back to the pitching staffs, is Kenley Jansen gave up 13 home runs this season. We saw last fall that power, I don't know if this is going to be the case every season looking ahead, but last year, the postseason almost seemed like a turbocharged version of the regular season with even more strikeouts and even more home runs. And so if a pitcher is home run prone, and Jansen just doesn't seem to be himself lately because of a physical issue, and he's giving up home runs at that rate, all it takes is a game or two or a home run or two, and that series is gone. Now, so then it becomes a question of how flexible is the manager. Last year, we saw the Astros manager basically give up on his closer after he gave up a few big hits. And we might see that again with the Dodgers. And then the question becomes, do they have outstanding relief pitchers who can fill in after him? And the answer probably is they do, because they have all the starting pitchers they don't need.
That's right. That's right. New roles can be invented in October. My question about the Rockies, this was a team I was very eager in early September to take on. I thought, looking at the underlying numbers, the Dodgers seemed the clear play to win the NL West. I expected them to win the NL West rather easily. Sure didn't come down to anything too easy, having to go to that 163rd game. The Rockies' underlying numbers, very blah. But having watched them so closely in September, I'm fully aware that this might be me getting fooled by watching a short span of games, really, in the course of a season, just paying attention closely to them for September. But my gut, my just sort of baseball watching since I was a little kid, gut tells me that the Rockies are a little bit better than their underlying numbers suggest. And I was very afraid of them in the wild card game, and not to redboard, but I mean, I thought they were a reasonable price in the game that happened last night. What's your gut on the Rockies? Do the numbers tell the story, or do the eyeballs in September tell the story?
I wouldn't necessarily focus just on September. Obviously, they played exceptionally well down the stretch. Shockingly, really.
That's what I thought.
I still, for the most part, I would focus on their underlying numbers over the course of the season. And they outscored their opponents by only 35 runs, which is, as you know, basically nothing. They could almost easily have finished below 500 as win 91 games. In fact, it's almost exactly a dead even heat. That said, I do think they're a little better in the postseason than the regular season, because one of the things that they didn't do well this season was pitch at the back end of their rotation. Kyle Freeland, who started the wild card game, had a tremendous season when you consider the ballpark. Germán Marquez also had an outstanding season when you consider the ballpark. So if they can leverage the innings with those two guys, I think they're better than their overall team numbers, and especially because they do lean on their bullpen. You know, it's funny. I just assumed that their bullpen was tremendous this season because they were so good last year under new manager Bud Black, but they really weren't that great. I mean, they had some guys in some big roles with ERAs around 6.5. And I don't know that that's a fluke. They gave up a lot of home runs and didn't strike out a ton of guys. So where does Bud Black find the innings? I'm not sure. I think he seems to have settled into better pitchers than Brian Shaw and Jake McGee, who struggled this season so much, pitching a fair number of innings. But Chris Rusin, too, also had an ERA at 6 with a lot of innings. So it really didn't go that well. The biggest reason for their subpar run differential for a playoff team anyway is the fact that they had 3 relief pitchers combining for an ERA well above 6 in 150-some innings, 160 innings. So that's, if you take those guys out of the equation, and you can do that in October, then they start looking quite a bit better. So I think they're probably better than the run differential. I don't think they're better than their overall record. That
makes perfect sense. When you look at head-to-head during the regular season, especially recent form, if you're talking about horses and you were comparing the Rockies and the Dodgers, you'd see, well, 4 wins in a row. What chance would the Rockies have against them? The Dodgers, were just looking at those little pieces of data, would appear to be clearly superior. In your experience looking at baseball teams and specifically postseason series, how much of an effect, if any, or how much credence, I should say, if any, do you give to that idea of head-to-head form or recent head-to-head form when you're trying to predict what's going to happen the next time the team plays?
0, or very close to 0. I mean, look, as we said, the Rockies outscored their opponents by 35 runs this season. The Dodgers outscored theirs by 194, excuse me. It's just a massive difference. And that's why the Dodgers won the head-to-head games, or will win the head-to-head games over the course of, you play enough. The Dodgers are much better than the Rockies. And when you talk about head-to-head samples, though, you're talking about such incredibly small numbers. And I think that's where the amateur bettor gets into trouble with baseball, is focusing on the small sample sizes. Yeah, there are things to be learned. I mean, look, if a starting pitcher pretty clearly is not healthy, yeah, you probably don't want to bet on him. Obviously, but when you're talking about entire teams, most of those things sort of wash away, and you just want to figure out how good are these matchups and who's pitching, how good is this hitter, what would we project him to do over the course of not a game, but a season against maybe this starting pitcher. That's about as granular, I think, as you can get. And looking at head-to-head matchups, to me, look, I'm not smart enough to say that something like that is worthless, but it would be one of the last things I would think to look at.
Perfectly logical. For me, it's always a question of balancing the overall numbers, finding out what in the short-term form and form cycles of a team is relevant. And I think you hit on one of the key ones there, Rob, with injury, when you can try to separate the difference between poor performance that's just you can put down to randomness versus poor performance that has an underlying cause. And of course, you get into all kinds of guesswork with that. But I think we've talked enough about this postseason, at least for now, Rob. Maybe we'll do some more as we go on this month in the baseball postseason. But I really want to talk to you about Powerball. Haven't had a chance to read the whole thing. I'm in the 3rd inning, so I got a ways to go. And what this book does, and it's a tradition really, is taking that pitch by pitch really look at an entire baseball game. And I think you got to be very happy with the time you chose to do this experiment, because it does seem we're really at the leading edge. We're at an amazing time in baseball where things are changing so rapidly. How did this project come about? Did the changes happening in the game inform your decision to write this type of book, or was that a little bit of a happy accident?
Well, it was completely happy accident. The whole thing was essentially an accident, at least from my perspective, because it wasn't a book that I had ever thought about writing. Because, as you mentioned, there's a tradition, and for better or worse, probably for worse, I tend not to think about writing in traditions. I tend to think about writing something that hasn't been done before, which sounds nice, but there are reasons for things not being done before. They're not great ideas, probably. Most of the great ideas have already been taken. And in fact, you're right. This book, this concept, this framework for a book has been around for quite a long time. I mentioned a few in the introduction and left out a few. I just was at the Powell's here in Portland last night and ran across Keith Hernandez's book. I think it was his first book. He did the same thing. Actually, not that I had to go to Powell's. I own the book. I had just forgotten that I had it. And most of them, not all of them, but most of them tend to be written by players or managers, and they tend to go through a game pitch by pitch and really drill deeply into the mechanics of a game. My book is more on the lines of what Dan Okrent did 30-some years ago, where he used the game not as a way to drill into the mechanics or the intricacies of the slider, although there's some of that too, but talk about the game about Major League Baseball in a more general way. And I so I think Dan's book is probably the closest to mine, but I would not really say that my book is like Dan's, because Dan spent basically 5 years reporting and writing his book. Mine was done more quickly, a lot more quickly, in about 7 months. And I did a fair amount of reporting. I spoke to, 45 people for the book, including a number of players in the game, which was a lot of fun. But there's also, as you know, a lot of me in this book. Personal, I shouldn't say personal essays, but editorials / essays, mini essays about things that are happening out there. Just in that sense, it's sort of a recap of what I've seen and what I've learned just as a baseball fan over the last 35, 40 years.
Well, I'm very pleased with what I've read so far. Tell us which teams you picked and why you picked them, and then why this game.
Well, you mentioned the happy accident, and I should have mentioned, too, that, again, the book wasn't my idea. An editor came to me, my editor, Eric Nelson, at Harper Collins, came to me last fall and said, I'd love someone to do an updated version of Dan Okrent's book, 9 Innings, and I think you might be great for it. And
great idea. Why didn't I think of that?
Fastest book deal I've ever been involved with. From that first conversation to putting a proposal together and an outline to having a deal was less than 2 weeks, I think, which is, and this is after I had pitched. Yeah,
for a non-celebrity book, that's an unheard of time frame as somebody who worked on that side of the publishing desk for a long time.
Right. So I figured. So I felt incredibly fortunate that it all came together the way it did, especially after I'd pitched a couple of other books that hadn't gone. So what you mentioned, the happy accident, also the game that we chose to sort of exemplify modern baseball, or what I call in the book postmodern baseball sometimes,
right,
was an A's-Astros game from last September. And the A's angle was in part because of Moneyball, which is now 15 years old, believe it or not.
That's unreal.
And right, it is. To me, it seems like yesterday. That's part of growing old, is things that happened 15 years ago.
Weren't we just in the Fenway bleachers with Michael Lewis at the Sabre convention? Wasn't that like 2 years ago, tops?
That's right. It seems like it, doesn't it? I remember it well myself. Specific conversations and sitting and talking about with you and Michael and a couple other friends. So yeah, it does seem like yesterday, but it was 15 years ago. So this book is not an update of Moneyball, nor is it a response to Moneyball. One review called it the anti-Moneyball, which I found befuddling. Yeah. It was a positive review, so I couldn't complain, but it was a strange thing to stick in there. So it was nice to have that angle, the Moneyball angle, and obviously the Astros. We picked the game before last year's postseason. So I suppose it was a happy accident that the Astros wound up winning the World Series. It was maybe even a happier accident that the A's are having such a great season this year. Now, that could all end in one game against the Yankees, but nobody had them doing what they did this year. Nobody. And I still would challenge anyone to look at what that team did and explain how they did it, because they basically lost. I think it might be literally true that every single one of their starting pitchers at the start of the season wound up going on the disabled list for long periods of time. And they basically had one guy who started the season as a nominal ace, and he started the season with an ERA above 6 and was out, and that was it. So it really is. The A's this season are one of the best testaments to the utter unpredictability of baseball that you will ever see. And that's one of the running themes in the book, by the way, is that even with all the analytics that so many teams have embraced, it's still incredibly unpredictable. All they're trying to do is smooth out a few edges at the margins, but there's still so much in the middle that they just can't predict. And the Astros this season, another example. I mean, yes, they were tremendous, which we all expected, but how did they do it? Most of their hitters were significantly worse this season than last season. And what happened? Well, the pitchers were even better this year than they were last year. Last year, their pitchers weren't that great because of injuries mostly, and this year they were tremendous.
It's, I think the best line about it, vis-a-vis the unpredictability, goes to Lewis, not surprisingly, where he talks about, and he's talking about Bean, of course, and it wasn't in Moneyball, but it was in that great article he wrote that was a response to the various people pillorying him from the inside of Major League Baseball after the book came out. And the point was, he's not a magician. And the exact analogy he used, completely appropriate to gambling and betting on baseball, because this is what we do when we make wagers. Where we try to be like the card counter in the casino, and whatever it is that we can use to get that edge, even if, as our associate Jonah Carey calls it, the another book that I believe you had something to do with, the extra 2%, even if it's 2%, in the long run, if you can turn those odds in your favor, the money will eventually flow your way, which is why, despite the imperfection of baseball analytics, they're so useful and interesting and fun to follow just as a fan, and potentially profitable to use if you're going up to the counter and making bets. So I'll ask you a really difficult question to close out this interview, Rob. And maybe you get into it a little bit in the book. I have, like I said, I'm early days. But if you were to take a look from what you've been hearing, from what you've been seeing, at what another frontier might be, what's something that teams are going to look to next? We've seen launch angles, we've seen deploying pitchers more efficiently. What do you think is next on the docket for the teams looking to get those odds in their favor?
I honestly wonder, because first of all, we're going to see the next thing that's going to make people really sit up and notice is we're going to see more of the openers, the pitchers who come in, who start a game and go 2 innings. It's obviously already happened, but because it was mostly, most famously anyway, well, not famous, it was most notably done by the Rays this season. I think a lot of people didn't really notice. We're going to see more of that. So that's going to be the obvious one. I think a lot of the big changes are going to come not from the team side, but they're going to come from the player side, as the players look for ways to get better. We've seen so many shocking improvements. J.D. Martinez and this season Max Muncy came out of nowhere to become one of the best hitters in the National League. I mean, he was supposed to be a AAA first baseman, a roster filler, and instead he's been out just amazing. So there is so much room for improvement on the player performance side that I think people just didn't really understand how much room there was, and they're just now getting it. And one of the things that we're going to see is, and I don't even think I mentioned this in the book because it's not really happening. It hasn't really happened yet, but it is happening. Other levels of baseball is what they call wearables, and I'm sure you're familiar with them, and I'm sure they probably made them for horses now. These, whether they're a sleeve you can put on or something on your knee, wraps around, whatever it is, tiny gyroscopes, et cetera, that can measure the forces, the angles, the inertia, whatever, all these different qualities, and they can do a great deal to improve performance, to keep you healthy. And believe it or not, Major League Baseball players have resisted wearables because they're afraid that the data collected would be used against them in contract negotiations, arbitrations, that sort of thing. But it's inevitable that everyone will be using these things within a few years. There's just no way. You can't stop it. And once major leaguers have embraced these things, it's going to change the game. It's hard to say exactly how, but it's going to change the game.
We've seen it with StatCast data and the changes that ensue. The book is Powerball: Anatomy of a Modern Baseball Game, available wherever fine books are sold as of October 9th. You can pre-order right now on Amazon. Rob Neyer is my guest. Thank you, Rob. And now, a tale from the diamond. Sometimes on the other podcast, we do tales from the track. This one relates to baseball betting and a tough decision I had to make. Let's flash back to the end of Saratoga, a Saratoga where, by the end, I was pretty frustrated. Tough meet, a lot of tricky results, DQs, etc., that led me to a pretty frustrated place. Historically in my life, one area where I've done pretty well is baseball betting, especially baseball betting that it doesn't come down to one game. I've done well on season over-unders, finding interesting positions in season, occasionally even in game. And when I looked at the baseball odds coming back from Saratoga, I saw what had to be a terrific opportunity in my mind. The Los Angeles Dodgers, at the time, I think they were half a game behind the Rockies. Arizona was on their heels. But the Dodgers, whose underlying numbers, especially run differential, were much better than the other two teams, were 4-5 to win the NL West. I thought, just doing some quick math, looking at the schedule, etc., that a better number would have been 3-5, if not 1-2 at that point. I thought they were clearly superior, and they had a matter of weeks to get things right. I made the wager. And I made a wager that was at the larger side of wagers that I make. Significant amount of money at a time when I was bankroll depleted, but I felt really good about the position. Then the next few weeks happened. At one point, I started pretty much literally counting the money. That was when there were 9 games to play and the Dodgers were up 2.5 games. And then a funny thing happened on the way to cash at the window. The Rockies stopped losing. They ran off something like 7 wins in a row. The Dodgers had a little bit of a hiccup against Arizona, a team that looked completely dead against the Rockies, came back to life to beat the Dodgers 2 out of 3. And all of a sudden, it looked like this bet was very, very losable. Still, looking ahead to the last weekend, I felt okay. There was a particularly interesting pitching matchup on the last day of the season. Max Scherzer for the Nats scheduled to face off against the Rockies. I still felt okay about the opportunity for the Dodgers to get this at least to a game 163, if not just win the thing over the weekend, even though at that point they were a game down. Weekend comes and goes. The Dodgers win all 3 away at San Francisco. The Rockies managed to lose a game on Saturday. Scherzer ends up getting pulled on Sunday. The Rockies win easily, and that sends us to game 163. Now, I'm not a person who is in a rush to hedge. I certainly will hedge when it's a smart thing to do. With in-game betting, I'm very likely to hedge just to create situations where I'm green on both sides of a bet. With this kind of bet, I didn't really want to go that way. I thought the Dodgers were going to win this rather easily, and now it's all down to a game 163. So, the question, to hedge or not to hedge? Well, I handicapped the game. And looking at Germán Márquez and how great he'd been in September, I got scared. Here was a chance to take a free bet, get about 20% of what I would have won versus 0 on the downside by taking a hot pitcher on a team that had won something like 9 out of 10 at plus money at nearly 8-5. I decided to go ahead and make the hedge. I And of course, the Dodgers then rather easily win game 163. So the question is, did I make the right decision? And I'm going to go ahead and say that while part of me going to bed that night did think about the 80% of my bet that I didn't win, that I did make the right decision. And part of it comes down to one of the unheralded skills, if you will, in gambling. I talk all the time about networking as an unheralded skill that a lot of successful bettors have, whether it's horses or baseball or football or whatever it happens to be. Here's another one: preservation of capital. Where I was with my bankroll on that Monday, I didn't make that bet to come down to one day. I made that bet because it had 3 weeks to play out. The ability to take some money off the table, but more importantly, win or lose, not risk that large-ish bet. It was the right thing to do, and I'm not going to beat myself up over it. Thank you all for listening to this therapy session. Obviously, I'm second-guessing it to some point, or I wouldn't still be talking about it days after the fact. And that is all for this maiden voyage on the DRF Sports Form podcast. I'm Peter Thomas Fornatale. I want to thank producer Craig Gorbanoff, producer AJ Wash. I want to thank Scott Gramling, Jonathan Kinchen, Rob Neyer as well for their contributions to the show. Most of all, thanks to all of you for listening. We'll be back with more next week. Until then, I hope the ball bounces your way.